Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're talking about gender this week. We want to understand what that means when we say gender, when I say gender. We want to understand why we would talk about gender in human geography. And there's several TED Talks and a couple of different videos that I posted to go along with this lecture. So please watch those as you watch this lecture or after you watch this lecture. And remember, a week from Thursday, so on the 23rd, you have a quiz on this book. This book is Habibi, and remember, there's not study guides that go along with the quizzes. So just read it, and as long as you take away the main points of the book, you should be fine. Remember, it's a graphic novel. So it's not, if you're looking at a book this size and you're like, I can't read that in a week, it's mostly pictures for one. And if you're reading it or as you read it, it kind of goes between the story of the two main characters and then it goes a lot into Islam. We're going to talk about Islam in this class and go into detail on it. So don't worry about remembering that part of the book. I mean, still read it, of course, because it has a lot to do with the main characters and stuff like that. But a lot of times I'll have students read this and they're like, I can't remember all this stuff about numerology and about Hagar and Ishmael, and I don't know what's going on. Don't worry about the religious parts of the book. I'm not going to quiz you on those parts of the book. Okay, so, and that's on the 23rd, and that will be on Canvas. Same way your last quiz was. All right, so we're talking about gender. Let me pull up this. Dun, dun, there we go. So our quote of the day is a Margaret Sanger quote. I don't know if you know who she is, but she's the woman who founded Planned Parenthood. She was a nurse. She was a nurse in the 1919s and 1920s in New York. And because of something called the Comstock laws, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, nurses and medical providers weren't allowed to talk to people about reproductive systems. So you had this whole combination of things happening in the 19 teens and 1920s that I'm going to talk about in just a minute that made it very, very dangerous to get pregnant in the US at that time. And Margaret Sanger saw all of these women whose lives were endangered because of the way that pregnancy was handled and childbirth was handled at that time. And she couldn't talk to any of them about birth control. She wasn't allowed to talk to them about birth control, about their cycles. She wasn't allowed to talk to them about their menstrual cycle. And she thought that was wrong. So she did a whole lot. She protested and she was arrested many times, and she eventually founds the clinic, the women's clinic that becomes Planned Parenthood. And she was the person who came up with the idea of the birth control pill. She didn't do the research into it, but she had this idea when she was protesting a whole lot in the 1920s and in the 1930s. She had this idea that we needed something to cause temporary infertility. Temporary infertility was really important. Now, if you know, infertility means you're not fertile, right? You can't have a baby. But she knew that you needed to be temporary infertile, meaning that young women could take a pill to create temporary infertility, and put off childbirth and pregnancy to later in their life, and hopefully to like a time of their choosing. She thought that this was a very, very important part of women's liberation and of a balanced society. And we're going to learn why she would have thought that today. But the story of how the birth control pill comes about is really interesting. So she is talking about this need for temporary infertility in the 1920s and 1930s. And one of the people that really listens to her is a woman who later inherits $1 billion, that's with a B, in the 1950s. And she decides, the second woman decides, okay, I want to do something great with this money. Like I could kind of parcel it out, but I want to do like one big thing with this money. And she remembered Margaret Sanger, this nurse, who had talked about this temporary infertility pill that she wanted to create. So she starts talking to Margaret Sanger. She's like, okay, we have the money. And at the time in the 1950s, birth control was mostly illegal. The condom was legal, but it was only legal for men to buy, and research on birth control was illegal. So they had to find this rogue scientist, this person who had already been thrown, who had already been not disbarred, because that's when you're a lawyer, but the equivalent of being disbarred. I can't remember what it is right now, where he was thrown out of the scientific community. And so they brought him, because he was doing research on birth control, and they brought him in, and the three of them in secret, and they had the help of this one other scientist as well, who I know contributed a whole lot. They essentially came up with a birth control pill, and they did it with illegal research. They did it like literally hidden away, with this funding coming in from this woman who'd inherited $1 billion, and they created the birth control pill. And when they marketed it, it was actually illegal, like I said, for women to have birth control and to put birth control in the market. So they marketed it as a pill that would regulate your period, and they put in the possible side effects, temporary infertility. So it wasn't until 1965 that the birth control pill and birth control became legal for married women, and it wasn't until 1972 that it became legal for single women. Think about that. And think about all the changes that have happened in society, in the US society, since the 1970s, since not only the birth control pill was invented, but it was legal for women to have access to, regardless of marital status. Think about access to education, increase in access to education we've seen with women in the last 40, 50 years. Think about the increase in women who represent us politically, and women who are in positions of management. All of that coincides with access to the birth control pill, as well as abortion, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So Margaret Sanger, the nurse who started Planned Parenthood, said birth control is the first important step women must take toward the goal of her freedom. It is the first step she must take to be man's equal. It's the first step they must both take toward human emancipation. And notice that they must both take. Think about that she includes both men and women in this idea of birth control as the key to human emancipation. Think about why that would be. Okay, I decided to add 2 more extra credit movies to the list of extra credit movies that I gave you. And if you don't know what those are, they're in a previous lecture. They're in the lecture on population. So The Mask You Live In, if you haven't seen that, The Mask You Live In is a movie about, if you say it really fast, what does it sound like? The mask you live in. Does it sound like masculinity? It's about masculinity in society, because remember, we're talking about gender. Gender doesn't just mean women. Gender means gender. So The Mask You Live In is about masculinity in society, and watch it. And then Tangerine. Has anybody seen Tangerine? Tangerine is a movie. It's not a documentary. It was shot completely on an iPhone, and it's about trans sex workers in Hollywood. So check it out and write a review on it. All right. So what do women, or we could say, what does gender and geography have to do with, this is blocked by this bar, with each other? Okay, that's it. So why would we talk about gender in a geography class? And first, let's get the definition of gender down, because a lot of times people confuse gender and sex, and they think sex is one thing and gender is another thing. And people I think like saying gender in as a replacement for the word sex, because if you say the word sex, people think that they're saying the word sex, and as soon as you say sex, they're like, oh no. But sex is biological. So have you heard of those gender reveal parties that have become popular in the last couple of years? You know, where you're pregnant and at about 16 weeks, you can find out the sex of the baby. So you have a party, you know, because it's not enough to have like a baby shower and et cetera, et cetera. So we have now added another party to have when you're pregnant. And maybe the doctor writes down the sex of the baby and you give it to somebody, and they bake like a cake and you cut into the cake, and if it's pink, it's female, if it's blue, it's male, right? Or you pop a balloon, or there was something that I saw that started a fire where it was like somebody shot it a cannon and it exploded like either pink or blue dust to let them know if they were having a boy or a girl. There's so much to unpack in the idea of a gender reveal party. First is the name, gender reveal. When you're not revealing their gender, you're revealing their sex, right? Sex is biological. That's all you know so far. All you know so far is what a doctor can see through an ultrasound, which is what sex organ your baby has. The idea that we're having a gender reveal party says so much about society. It tells us how we link sex and gender, for one. And it tells us how much we place, even before you're even born, on you based on what your sex organ is. Those two colors, right, pink and blue, are so important to our cultural concept of gender. The idea that pink is feminine is, and all the stuff that we put on the idea of being feminine, and that blue is masculine. First of all, those colors are highly cultural. If we were to go to Iran, pink is a masculine color. If we were to go to other parts of the world, those colors don't necessarily reflect masculinity or femininity. Excuse me. So before we're even born, we've already been given these roles based on our sex. So a lot of people might be saying like, oh, that's just that's just like a tiny little thing, the idea of separating sex and gender, but it's not. Because our ideas about gender are social. So this construct of gender, this word gender, has to do with social ideas of what it means to be male or female, for one. So when we're studying gender in geography, what we're studying is the social construct that comes out of a different culture, and how that social construct is placed on people depending on if they're male or if they're female. So the reason that we study geography and gender, the reason that those two things are really difficult to even separate, and it's not, when I used to talk about gender and geography, even when I talk to some geographers about gender in geography, I get this kind of reaction like that's some sort of a fringe, or I've been told it's a fluffy subject. But if you think about it, what is geography? Human geography. Human geography is the study of culture. It's the study of society around the world. And if society is based on ideas of survival, right? If we need to have a functioning economy, if we need to have laws in place that keep us from killing each other and hurting each other, if we need to have a social safety net that keeps us somewhat taken care of throughout our lives, that's what society is, right? It's creating those three kind of basic things: having a functioning economy, functioning way to survive, having laws that keep us from murdering each other or hurting each other without being penalized for it, and having a social safety net. That's what culture is. So much of those three things rely on cultural ideas of gender. So much of our three ideas of, let's say, a social safety net relies on cultural ideas of gender. If you don't know what I'm talking about, think about how we have these different cultural roles based on what your gender is. How I often hear that women are very intuitive, or women are natural caretakers, or things like that. Those are social constructs of gender. And so if women in this social construct are great caretakers, well, then it makes sense that we would take care of children, that we would take care of the home, and then that social safety net in our society that's necessary for a functional society. Do you see how it's reflected in gender? So the reason that we study gender in geography is because if geography is a study of society, one of the first ways that society distinguishes itself, one of the first ways that society creates rules for itself, is by creating gender identities. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that a lot of times people think gender is sort of fringe because they think it focuses mostly on women. And okay, let's say we are going to focus mostly on women. Women are 51% of the population. They're a majority of the population. If we want to understand the population, if we want to understand society, how can we really think that we're going to understand society without understanding 51% of the population, over half of the population. It's like when economists attempt to study the economy without studying natural resources. How can you really understand the economy if you don't understand the fuel, literally the fuel, the natural resources that go into different economic structures, right? So we know why we want to study gender in geography. And we also understand so far that gender is the social construct and sex is the biological construct. And I think one of the reasons that in those gender reveal parties, they call them gender reveal parties, is because people don't want to have a party called a sex reveal party, right? And that becomes this whole other thing where it's like, you know, a lot more people might go, for one, if you have what you would call a sex reveal party, and expectations from a sex reveal party might be a little bit different. And when you get there and find out all you're going to get is a pink piece of cake, you might have some disappointed people. All right, so we have the idea that gender is a function of society, and that within different societies, that term gender and which gender you're identified as is going to put different rules on you, different expectations, different ideas about your personality, different ideas about what kind of job you would like to go into, if you can expect to be paid for that job, all that kind of stuff. All right. So one way of looking at gender in our society is something called the Bechdel test. And actually, I'm going to come right back to the Bechdel test. So before I start talking too much about women, because I'm going to start talking about women in just a minute, let's understand men in society. And I'm going to continue to talk about men in society throughout this lecture. Excuse me. And in these next couple of lectures, so we have gender now, we're going to talk about race and ethnicity next time. And then the next time we're going to talk about the queer community, LGBTQ+, in all of those. So in every one of these topics, whether we're talking about gender, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about ethnicity, whether we're talking about the queer community, every single one of those, gender is going to play a role. And in every one of those, being LGBTQ+ is going to play a role. And in every one of those, ethnicity and race is going to show up. So what I mean is when we're talking about gender, you can't talk about it in a colorless world, right? You can't talk about gender and not understand how ethnicity impacts gender, race impacts gender. We can't talk about race or ethnicity and not understand, again, how gender is going to affect race and ethnicity. And we can't understand how the LGBTQ world, if we don't also understand race and ethnicity within the LGBTQ world, we also can't understand the LGBTQ world without understanding gender. So in this last section of class, a lot of what we talk about intersects. And if you haven't heard that term before, intersectionality, that's what it's referring to. Intersectionality, this idea that, okay, we could talk about gender, but gender for me has a lot of similarities for other women, but not all women. Gender for me, it might be reflected differently if I'm a queer woman, if I'm an immigrant, if I am a, what else am I that's exciting? Jewish. All of those things also affect me in a different way. What about if I'm talking to a woman, like I'm talking from me, a woman talking to another woman, and we're talking about gender, but she's a woman of color and I'm a white woman. How is our interpretation of gender going to change because of the ways that society may have treated us differently based on ethnicity? How does being queer come into that? How might you be treated differently depending on what your ethnicity is if you're queer? Does that make sense? So intersectionality is the idea that when you talk about marginalization in society, which is what we're talking about with gender, it's very difficult to talk about it in an isolated vacuum. You can't talk about gender on its own without bringing ethnicity in. can't talk about ethnicity without bringing in gender. You can't talk about being queer without bringing in gender and bringing in ethnicity. All of those are constantly kind of affecting each other. So that idea of intersectionality, while we're talking about gender today, it's going to come up when we talk about race and ethnicity. And it's definitely going to come up when we talk about the LGBTQ community. Because for one, when we're talking LGBTQ, some of those have nothing to do with sexuality. We tend to think of that spectrum, the LGBTQ spectrum, as being one that's completely around sexuality. But being trans doesn't say anything about your sexuality. Being a transgender person has everything to do with gender and not so much sexuality. But we still talk about it in the LGBTQ or in sexuality or human sexuality because that LGB and the T get all put together. So while we're talking gender today, we will continue to talk about gender when we talk about race and ethnicity, and we will definitely talk about it again, because when we talk about sexuality and the queer community, we're going to talk about trans people, and trans has everything to do with gender, like I said. So now, before we talk about the Bechdel test, I also want to talk about the idea of masculinity. And again, masculinity is going to come up throughout this lecture. Masculinity will come up when we talk about race and ethnicity. Masculinity will definitely come up when we talk about the queer community. But I like to mention masculinity first off, because like I said, when we're talking about gender, it's not just about women, although that's usually often where people's brains go. I put up a lecture on, or not a lecture, a TED talk on the idea of toxic masculinity. And there's a man talking about how masculinity and the ideas of masculinity shaped him so much. So when we talk about masculinity in society, or I should say when we talk about women in society, there tends to be this inherent idea that if women are marginalized, excuse me, oh, sorry. Oh my God, this is terrible. Sorry. When we talk about men in society or masculinity, no, sorry, that's not what I was saying. When we talk about women in society and marginalization, people inherently tend to think that if women are marginalized, men are completely free. This comes up when I discuss Saudi Arabia in different classes. So I'll talk about Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has all kinds of laws that restrict women. So if you're in Saudi Arabia is a country. If we don't know where it is, let's look at our map. So here it is right here. Saudi Arabia is a country in the world with very, very strict rules if you're female, and if you're homosexual, by the way, as well. If you're part of the queer community, we'll forget it. This is one of the places that will jail or murder you for being queer. So if you're female, you're not allowed to leave your household without a male member of your family. You are, until recently, you weren't allowed to drive a car. So in the last 2 years, women have been allowed to drive a car. If you need to go to the hospital, if you don't have a man to consent to you getting an operation, it doesn't matter if you're going to die, you still have to have a man consent. And it's not just any man, like you're bleeding in the hospital and they're just like, hey, some guy. It has to be a male member of your family. It has to be your dad, it has to be your uncle, it has to be your husband, it can be your son or your brother. It can't be your cousin. So what else? There's all kinds of rules. Rules about if you can have a C-section. So if you're a woman and you're giving birth and you need to have an emergency C-section, they can't do it in Saudi Arabia unless they have your husband's permission. So they can't give you a C-section unless they have your husband's permission. So later in the class, when we talk about religion, because a lot of people tend to think, oh, that's because of Islam. And they tend to think that Islam is this inherently sexist religion. Well, I argue that it absolutely is not. And in fact, many of the things that we think of as misogynist inside Islam actually pre-exist the religion. They existed in those parts of the world before the religion, but when the religion, Islam becomes a prominent religion in North Africa and Southwest Asia, this whole region of the world, it was actually founded by this person. This is what you're going to read in Habibi, and this is what I'm going to argue later when we talk about religion. It was founded by Muhammad, and I argue that Muhammad, in his founding of this religion, was attempting to get away with a lot of the laws that had so thoroughly marginalized women in this region. And we're talking about 500 after Christ, right? So we're talking about like the year 562. But as the religion spread, so I argue that the religion was based on giving women rights, and I argue that the Arabian rights movement 700 years ago is the first female women's rights movement in the world. But a lot of the things that we think of as misogynist today, that we blame today on Islam, actually pre-existed the religion. And when the religion spreads through this area, through Southwest Asia and through North Africa, a lot of the old customs then get absorbed into that religion. And if you don't believe me on this, or if you're like, that sounds very convenient, that's true in so many of our universalizing religions. Remember, I said that term earlier in class. Universalizing is a religion that attempts to appeal to as many people as possible, as opposed to an ethnic religion. If you remember, I said that Judaism is an ethnic religion. You have to be born into it. It's not trying to appeal to people. It's not trying to bring in converts. Islam and Christianity were trying to bring in converts, are still trying to bring in converts. And so when they spread, they often, because they're monotheist religions, they often took over the cultures of the places that they were spreading to. And so a lot of the cultures kind of found their way of kind of seeping through and then finding a new place in that religion. So just think, yesterday was Easter, and that's the resurrection of Christ, and the crucifixion would have happened on Friday. And we celebrate that with eggs and with bunnies and with all kinds of different things that really don't have anything to do with the resurrection of a man who would have lived, where's my arrow, all the way down here, and would have been resurrected down here. It has everything to do with the pagan religions that existed in Europe before Christianity gets there. And so does Christmas. Do you think about Christmas? We don't know when Jesus was born, but we give him this calendar day of December 25th. And we don't know why you would associate things like a Yule log or a Christmas tree or all of these things that have to do with cold weather with a man who would have been born, again, in a very, very warm place. So the reason that I bring all this up, and I'm going to bring this up again when we talk about religion, is that a lot of our religions today have absorbed customs of the places that they've gone into. So Christianity spreads into Europe, so it spreads from Southwest Asia down here, and it spreads into Europe. And when it spreads into Europe, it adopts a lot of the cultures that would have pre-existed Christianity. Things like the winter festival that people celebrated, this festival of lights, right at the winter solstice around December 25th. And the coming of spring that people would have celebrated right at the beginning of spring, right now. And they would have celebrated it with colored eggs and et cetera, et cetera. Does that make sense? So when we look at what people often think of as the misogyny of Islam, because we see it in Southwest Asia, I argue that it actually pre-exists Islam and has to do with cultural ideas that would have come from here before. So when we look at, say, Saudi Arabia, we see a whole lot of laws that restrict women's movement, restricts access to determine what's right for their body, restricts access to paid labor. So one interesting thing that I like to tell students is that 70% of the university students in Saudi Arabia are female. 70% of university students in Saudi Arabia are female, but they're only 5% of the workforce. So Saudi Arabia restricts women from entering the paid workforce unless they are doing a job that only women could do. So there's female police officers, because like patting down a woman is something that a woman needs to do. There's female nurses, because again, they want women to be present in places where other women might be examined and stuff like that. But they only allow what turns out to be about 5% of the workforce to be women. But there's a lot of women who are going to school, and I want you to think about why that is. Why would you go to college knowing that you're never going to use it in the workforce, that you live in a country that restricts you from using it, that doesn't allow you to use it? So think about why that would be. So when I describe all this about Saudi Arabia, describe the restrictive laws about divorce, like if you're a woman, you're not allowed to initiate a divorce. You can get divorced, and there are divorces in Saudi Arabia, but a woman doesn't actually have control over getting divorced. A man has control. In fact, there's just a law that was passed in Saudi Arabia that restricted men from alerting their wife by text message about their divorce. So they just restricted and said, okay, men, if you want to divorce your wife, you have to actually talk to her. You can't just text her. Imagine what that text is like, right? Me plus you equals frowny face. Our marriage is over. So when I describe all of those laws about Saudi Arabia, I often ask students, so what's it like to be a man in Saudi Arabia? And I usually get the reaction, oh, it would be great. It would be fantastic. It would be wonderful. And I'm always surprised by that. Because one, would it be wonderful if you know that over half the population is restricted so much? Like, would you actually be happy living in a society where the female population can't go to the hospital unless a male member of their family can go with them, for one? So would you be happy if other people are restricted just because you're not one of those people? But two, do you really think that it's fantastic to be a man in a society that's that restrictive of women? Because it's restrictive of men too. One, you can't drink alcohol. Alcohol is not legal here. Two, if you're a man and you want to go for a walk on your own, people are going to frown at you. If you're out without your family, you're thought to be some sort of a deviant. So you can't just go for a walk. You couldn't just make friends with a woman. You couldn't be in a college class with a woman and just start talking to her and just become friends with her, go and study with her, meet her for coffee, totally platonic. You couldn't do any of those things. So when we talk about gender, we can't just talk about one side. And we're not even yet getting into the concept of gender as being not biological, right? So I said that gender is social and sex is biological. But when we talk about the queer community, we're going to talk about being transgender. We're going to talk about transitioning and all of that information that goes along with the fluidity of gender. So when I say female and male in this class, in this lecture, I'm not being specific to biology. I'm talking about female identify, male identify, right? So when we talk about gender, we can't really separate male and female because how women are treated is going to reflect and affect how men are treated, and how men are treated is going to reflect and affect how women are treated. So keep that in mind. If I'm just talking about one or the other, think about how the other might be affected by what I'm talking about with this one. Okay, so keep that in mind. So if I'm talking about female circumcision, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, think about what that means and the societal expectations are on men. If I'm talking about male circumcision, which guess what, we're going to talk about that in just a minute, even though we touched on it in class earlier in the semester. Think about how male circumcision then reflects on expectations of women, etc., etc. Okay, so the Bechdel test. If you haven't heard of the Bechdel test, it's a test that has to do with movies. It comes from Alison Bechdel. She's a graphic novel artist. She wrote Fun Home, which is a pretty good graphic novel. Fun Home, it's about her. It's an autobiography about her and her relationship with her dad. And then she also wrote a book about her mom. Anyway, graphic novel artist. So Alison Bechdel came up with this test for movies. And the test is, when you're watching a movie, are there at least two named female characters? So are there at least two female characters that have names in the movie? Do they speak to each other? So not do they speak, like, so you have two named female characters, are they only speaking to men, or do you have two named female characters who are actually talking to each other? And when they're talking to each other, they speak about anything other than a male love interest. Now, you might think, huh, that's funny, or you can think of three movies off the top of your head or something like that. But there's actually very few movies that pass this test. And it seems surprising. And you might think, well, that's not a big deal because movies are about a lot of different things. You're right. Movies are about a lot of different things, and they don't all necessarily have to pass the Bechdel test. Of course, they don't. But remember, we're looking at how gender is reflected in society. What does it say about our society, especially a society that we think of as so forward, as so progressive? What does it say that somebody actually came up with this rule or with this test? You wouldn't have come up with this test if there wasn't a need to come up with it. Do you know what I mean? Like, you wouldn't arbitrarily come up with something where you're like, are there three books? Are those three books red? Like the color red, not red. Are those three books over 500 pages? You know what I mean? You wouldn't necessarily come up with something just because it's arbitrary. Alison Bechdel would have come up with this because she would have noticed, hey, in so many of the movies that I watch, there's not that many female characters. They don't necessarily have names. They don't often speak to each other. And when they speak to each other, they don't often talk about something that's not a male love interest. So think about the Bechdel test as you're sitting at home watching movies, or as you continue to watch movies, because of life. And think about what it says about our society, that we would have this test to begin with, and that not that many movies that are produced in our country today, in our progressive country today, actually pass it. And then think about how we judge other countries for their gender relations. All right, so let's talk about the Comstock laws. The Comstock laws I mentioned when I brought up Margaret Sanger, and I said that she couldn't talk. Remember when she was a nurse and she was delivering babies in New York, she couldn't talk to her patients about menstrual cycle. She couldn't talk to them about how they got pregnant, about how to keep themselves from getting pregnant. That's all part of something called the Comstock laws. So the Comstock laws start in 1873 in the US. They're federal laws that make it illegal to distribute obscene information. So first you have to think, what is obscene, right? And if we were in class, I would say, what is obscene? People would give all kinds of things as an example. But what is included in obscene in the Comstock laws is anything about women's reproductive rights, reproductive system. So their reproductive rights. But so it was illegal to distribute information that had anything to do with reproduction. So had anything to do with the uterus, had anything to do with eggs, had anything to do with the vaginal canal, had anything to do with the penis, how the penis works, how testicles work, how you impregnate a woman, all of that stuff. That was all considered obscene. So what effectively happens in 1873 is we're no longer allowed to learn about pregnancy and how pregnancy comes about. And this creates so many issues, so many issues. So think about what that means. Think about how much misinformation there is. First of all, think about how today we're allowed to learn all this stuff and we still don't learn it. Think about how we are allowed to learn today anything that we want to learn. That information is all out there, and we're not supposed to be restricted from information about our sex organs or about sex. And think about how little we learn. Think about how much misinformation is out there. And that's when we have access to material that teaches us and tells us the correct methods for birth control and the correct issues with STIs and STDs, sexually transmitted infections and diseases, and how little we still know. Think about how much misinformation is out there about abortion. I'll come back to that in just a minute. So even today, when we have access to all this information, we still have all this misinformation. I want you to think about why that is. Why, when we today have so much access to information, do we still not really understand what's happening, where, and why? And I would argue that the biggest reason that we have all this misinformation is because of culture, is because culturally it's not okay to talk about sex. Culturally, it puts you in a whole different category if you bring up stuff like sexuality or STIs or et cetera, et cetera. Just think about the way that you reacted to me in class and think about how that has to do with internalized ideas of how sexuality is inherently dirty. And the problem with that is that we then create a society that is so misinformed about the most basic part of our body, which is our reproductive system. You know what I mean? So 1873, federal laws come about that say you can't learn about your reproductive system. Obviously, this applies to porn and other stuff like that as well. And this coincides with laws that made midwifery illegal. So midwifery, so for as long as humans have been around, obviously we've been reproducing and giving birth. And for the majority of that time, the people who have attended those births, so the majority of human history around the world, the people who have attended births have been women. They've been trained, usually, not always trained. Um, they've been trained what we call midwives. So a midwife is somebody who attends a birth, not necessarily doctors. And in in the 1870s, we made it illegal here to have a midwife attend a birth. You had to have a doctor or no attendant. So you either had to pay a doctor or you had no attendant. You couldn't be a midwife anymore. You couldn't legally be a midwife unless you were accompanying a doctor. And this creates all kinds of issues. God, my voice is very sorry. So, so what that meant is if you couldn't afford to pay a doctor, didn't really have anybody attending your birth. So after this law was created, these laws that made midwifery illegal, 80% of the births in the US were not attended by somebody, by an informed person. So only about 20% of the population could afford a doctor to come to attend a birth, or there's other things that go in there as well. Ideas about how a strong woman gives birth at home without a doctor, cultural ideas about like you know, gendered ideas about how strength equals and the ability to get through something without screaming or needing help is somehow the uh, somehow qualifies you as a person who is strong and et cetera, et cetera. Um, so a lot of women couldn't afford to, and then there was also this cultural idea that women gave birth without a doctor because they were strong. Only weak women gave birth with a doctor, and what that led to was about 80% of births being unattended. Think about what that meant. We put in these laws that say you're not allowed to learn about your reproductive system, where babies come from, and nobody is allowed to attend your birth unless they're somebody that you're going to pay a whole lot of money for. And think about how many children women would have had, especially since they didn't have access to birth control or even information about the reproductive system. If you're having 8, 9, 10 children in your life, do you really have the finances to pay for a doctor to come? Only wealthy women would have been able to pay for that. So what that led to was a whole lot of women who started to die in childbirth. In fact, from 1900 to 1920 in this country, so over 20 years, more women died in childbirth or in faulty abortions than the casualties in World War I. That's how many women were dying when Margaret Sanger was a nurse. She was literally watching women die, and she couldn't tell them, okay, if you just use the rhythm method. Now, they wouldn't have had a lot of access to birth control at that time, but they did have condoms. Condoms were around. They did have access to the rhythm method. That's where you use the woman's menstrual cycle as a way of determining like when she could get pregnant, and you don't have sex on those days. Or, you could use the pull-out method. I don't know if I have said this joke before, but the pull-out method does not work very well. And if you don't believe me, you ask my 12-year-old. So, you know what happens when you're not so much in love, but out of a condom. So we had a whole lot of women who were dying as a result of the Comstock laws and these laws that required a doctor to attend a birth. Now, parts of these laws were repealed beginning in 1916. 1916 is when condoms become legal. Condoms had been illegal for a while, but they become legal. They become legal for sailors, though. So the only people who can buy condoms in the US starting in 1960 were sailors on active duty. Now, just think about what that says about ideas around sexuality, ideas around gender, that men, active duty men who are sailors, are allowed to buy condoms, but everybody else is not allowed to buy condoms. Who are they using those condoms on? They're using those condoms on people who aren't allowed to purchase the condoms. And then 1919, 1936, and 1936, there was a lot of the repeal was a result of Margaret Sanger and her repeated arrests and her passing out information. So what she started doing is she basically started printing pamphlets that told people about their menstrual cycle and told them things that they could do to avoid getting pregnant. And she was arrested over and over. But 1936, you see the repeal of those laws that say, okay, you're not allowed to learn basic things about your menstrual cycle or basic things about getting pregnant. And then 1960, that's when you start to see the beginning of really major repeals that lead eventually to the legalization of birth control for married women, and then eventually the legalization of birth control for unmarried women, for single women. 1960 is also the year that the birth control pill is invented, but remember I said it was illegal when it first started, so they had to market it as a pill to regulate your period. So a lot of misinformation that would have come as a result. That's annoying. That would have come, oh my God. A lot of the misinformation that would have come from these years of not being able to actually publish correct information led to ideas like masturbation made you blind, that oral sex led to, like how I had to, that oral sex led to other ailments like blindness, like infertility. There was this idea that people had in the 1950s that if you, particularly oral sex on women, so if you gave women oral sex, that it would lead to their infertility. Isn't that convenient? So what we're looking at, and with looking at the Comstock laws, are different ideas of how your body is treated depending on where you are in the world. So one way that we go about studying gender and geography is looking at how bodies are treated differently depending on where you're born. Now remember I said that if you're born in Saudi Arabia, if you're female, it means that you can't leave the house without a male member of your family. You're probably not going to enter the workforce. You don't have rights to a divorce, but your husband does. You don't have rights to testify. There has to be 2 women for every 1 man testifying. So your one testimony, if you're female, is half of what a male's testimony would be. But there's other ways that women's, or not just women, men's as well, we're going to get into that in just a minute, but that our bodies are treated differently depending on where we are in the world, and also depending on time, because some of these things don't exist anymore in this one. Okay, so if we're in Saudi Arabia, we're required to wear the niqab. So you have the hijab. The hijab is the head covering. The hijab is not required in Islam. It's a sign of modesty. A lot of Islamic women choose to wear it. And this is something that is a question as well that I hear, sort of people who will identify like women who are made to cover up in different parts of the world. It's a sign of a sexist society or a misogynist society, or that Islam is inherently misogynist because it tells women to cover up, without thinking about how women might choose that religion and how women might choose to cover up. So one thing that I want us to all be really cognizant of, really pay attention to, is, are we putting ideas onto people and assuming that they don't know what they want or what they need? I see this happen a whole lot. I see it happen with people of different ages. I see it happen with people of different genders. I see it happen with people of different ethnicities and races, where you'll have one person who's like, oh, that person just thinks that way because they have internalized racism or because they've internalized misogyny and they need to be liberated, without thinking, maybe they have thought about, maybe they understand, and maybe that is the way that they are choosing to represent themselves. So we want to be very cognizant of not placing rules on people based on the idea that we want to free them, right? Like so many different people think like, oh, if they only knew, then we would free them, without thinking maybe they do know. So when we look at something like the hijab, like I said, is not required in Islam. It's the head covering. And many women around the world choose to wear it as a sign of modesty and of their submission to Allah, which when we get to Islam, we'll understand what that means. But in Saudi Arabia, if you are out in public, you're required to wear this. The niqab is, so usually you have this kind of like long tube dress on underneath this, and then the niqab covers up and just lets your eyes out. The burqa is what you would have worn in Taliban controlled Afghanistan. Taliban controlled Afghanistan required women to wear this burqa. You would have been completely covered. In fact, I have a picture here. That's the burqa. Now we're looking at the backs of these women. They basically have their burqa up over themselves. So their front is going to be exposed, but when it's down, they're completely covered and you just have this mesh opening. Now, there's a book I read called by Khalid Hosseini. I don't know if you've read The Kite Runner, but he wrote 2 other books besides The Kite Runner. He wrote A Thousand Splendid Suns as well, which is a fantastic book. If you ever get a chance to read it, highly recommend it. But in it, you have this one character who's talking about, she gets married and it's before the Taliban comes to control Afghanistan, and her husband requires her to wear a burqa. And that aside, read the book and kind of figure out why that would happen. But she talks about the freedom that she feels in being covered up, that she feels she can go out in public and not be threatened by public. Now that says a whole lot about public and et cetera, et cetera. But again, think about how the people who are covering up are not faceless, nameless people. And think about the thought process and what it might mean, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we've got covering up and why you might cover up. Why might you cover up in Southwest Asia, by the way? Southwest Asia is where you have a lot of different customs that tell you to cover up. And it's not just women. Men are supposed to cover up as well. In Saudi Arabia, for example, men have to cover to their wrists and to their ankles. Same thing in Iran, same thing under the Taliban in Afghanistan. So it's not just women who are being covered up, but we tend to focus on women being covered up because their heads are specifically covered. So why might Southwest Asia be a place where you have customs that lead people to cover? Because we can look at other societies in the world that have really strict gender roles that don't necessarily tell women to cover up. And if you think about the landscape, again, I'll go back, this landscape right here, why might you create a culture, if cultural geography is the idea that culture comes out of your physical geography, what about this physical geography would lead to a culture that tells you to cover up? Think about it. Think about your exposure to the sun, your exposure to wind. Physical geography is something that shapes culture. And because we move around the world, because our cultures have bounced around the world with colonization, with imperialization, with globalization, all of that kind of stuff, we don't necessarily see the direct connection anymore. But think about this landscape and how it would lead to a culture that essentially tells people to cover up because you live exposed to the sun, as opposed to being in Hawaii, which again is a very sunny place, but is also very, very humid. And you don't want anything touching your body in that kind of a humid atmosphere, climate. So you have a culture that was all about nudity, or mostly nudity, because again, you had a physical geography that said clothing feels disgusting right now. Whereas here, clothing would have actually protected you. In this kind of dry heat, that sort of cloth covering would protect you from the sun, protect you from the wind, and actually keep you cooler, and gets incorporated into society and it becomes part of tradition. And that's what so much of our culture is. So much of our culture is things that started somewhere, originated somewhere, that had a practical reason that then grows into some sort of tradition. And that's what I was talking about earlier in the semester when I brought up male circumcision, that it started in this place, and I'll get back into that in just a minute if you don't remember me talking about it. but it started in this place of practicality and then it gets absorbed into culture. Okay, so over here we have the corset. The corset was, and we still have like different types of corsets today. I think the Kardashians have really brought back the corset, this like sucking in of your waist to create this hourglass shape, right? And corsetry, like this type of corsetry, the kind of corsetry you would have had in the 1800s, led to damage. It led to liver damage. It led to kidney damage because women would suck in their waists to like 21, 20 inches. In fact, in Gone with the Wind, there's this scene where the main character, Scarlett O'Hara, is being corseted. And as she's being corseted, uh, they say, you're never going to get back to 18 inches. That was her waist, 18 inches. If you can imagine how small that waist would be, and that there's a lot going on in your torso, like your liver, like your kidneys, like your stomach, like your lungs, like all of those things. I know lungs are further up, but if your lungs are up here and you're squishing your kidneys up and down, basically what's going to happen is they're going to be fighting with your lungs for space. So my cat is needing to get in. Hang on. Sorry. Okay. So over here, this is foot binding. Foot binding you've probably heard of. It was outlawed in China in 1908. It lasted for 2,000 years. So a good 2,000 years, you had people who had their feet bound. Now, it wasn't all women. It was women, and I want you to really think about this. Okay, so foot binding is the process. And if you can't tell, this is a picture of a foot. This is a foot that has been bound since the girl was about 6 years old. So you would start binding when the girl's about 6 years old. And what you do is you take a foot and you bind it so that as it grows, it basically grows like this. So instead of growing like this, it grows like this in this like very warped, literally broken way, so that you're walking on these broken feet. So this is her heel and those are her toes. And so and this is it all dressed up. So I want you to question, first of all, how you would have any mobility if your feet were broken. And you wouldn't have had real mobility. So who would have been able to do this? Only wealthy women. The poor women, and there was a slur for poor women, which was big-footed woman, right? Big-footed woman was like one of the worst things that you could call a woman, because what it essentially said is that she was so poor, she couldn't afford to bind her feet. She had to work. And if you're a big-footed woman, you're not going to be able to catch like a wealthy man, et cetera, et cetera. Your life is going to be one of servitude. Now, think about how many different beauty trends are beauty trends, right? They're sold to us as beauty trends. Just think about like right now, all the stuff on Instagram and other social media sites about like self-care and blah, blah, blah. All of it, so much of it has to do with, I'm not saying there's not such a thing as self-care, but so much of it has to do with being wealthy. So much of it has to do with like buying into, like literally like buying products that are going to empower you, right? It's like emancipation through narcissism. So how many of our beauty trends are sold to us do we buy into that are actually like literally hobbling us? And so think about how something like that or something like this or something like this serves to keep us contained. If we have these different ideas that a beautiful woman is one who walks around on high heels that are like 6 inches, well, how mobile is she really? A beautiful woman is one who like sucks her waist in and trains her waist to be very, very thin, even though it might inhibit your ability to breathe in deeply, to walk far, et cetera, et cetera. So and in no way am I trying to put down whatever your choice is, how you want to treat yourself, how you want to look. That's, again, completely your own choice. If you decide that you want to bind your feet or train your waist or et cetera, well, that's your choice. But I want you to think more about how society equates beauty with wealth and with immobility. So think about those trends around the world, how we tend to equate beauty with things that are only attainable for women who are wealthy. Think about it. If you think about the aging process here in the US, we don't like aging. We think that aging is this sign of I don't know what. So there's all these different things you can do for aging. So they all cost money though, right? If we think about how for a long time having very, very pale skin was a sign of beauty, it had a lot to do with wealth. Now, later it becomes a sign of colorism, which we'll talk about when we talk about racism in our next lecture. But it was also a sign of wealth because if you were working on, if you were a farmer, right? If you were outside working all the time, you got dark. Whereas if you were a person who was wealthy enough to stay inside to recline all day and you had servants taking care of you, well, then you got to be pale skinned, right? As opposed to later when the Industrial Revolution comes along and suddenly being tanned for European women was a sign of beauty. So forever for European women, the light skin was, and this isn't just European women, this is like around the world. Again, we'll talk about that next time when we talk about ethnicity and race. But if you were lighter skinned, it meant that you weren't out in the fields working. But then when the Industrial Revolution happens, and now workers go inside and they're working in factories, to be tan became the sign of beauty. So not like, hardened by the sun, but just kissed by the sun. That becomes the sign of beauty because it means that you're not working in a factory. You have time to go outside and like go to the beach and walk around. See? So much of our idea of beauty has to do with wealth. It tells you about wealth, right? And it also tends to reflect immobility. So think about that and come back at me with examples. All right, so how our bodies are treated. I have this picture up of a couple different tattoos. Neither of these are my tattoos, if people are wondering. Talking about pale skin, my skin has never been that dark. My skin goes from this to red. So I bring up tattoos though because it's another, again, way that we might treat bodies differently based on gender. So if you know about where tattoos come from, they come from the South Pacific. That's where they were invented. Different South Pacific cultures, like for example, Polynesian culture, tattoos were ways of identifying people, maybe something that you had done. Maybe if you were a warrior and you had done certain things, you'd achieved certain things in your society, you were tattooed as a result of it. And then sailors, when they start to go into the South Pacific from Asia, from Europe, from Africa, they bring back this tattooing, they bring back this whole body art, and they spread it through Asia and through Africa and through Europe. And in different times in history, it's been considered less okay, more okay, depending on where we are. So most recently, it's been considered, now it's becoming more okay. But for the last 70 years or so, it was something that was seen as pretty negative and trashy and whatever. And a big reason for that is because of World War II. I don't know if you're aware, but in World War II, in a couple of different camps, so Auschwitz, for example, they tattooed the skin of prisoners, and so they like gave them these numerical tattoos. And so after World War II, it actually becomes negatively associated with like the forced tattooing of Nazi prisoners and camps. And then also in the 1950s, if you look at US society, it was all about conformity. It was all about fitting into like this ideal of American purity. And so one way of showing that you're not pure is to apparently mark up your skin. So in the last 20 years, though, really, last 20 years, tattooing has become something that's more and more and more socially acceptable. And I want you to think about how we once again have different gender ideas of who it's acceptable for and why certain people do get tattooed and et cetera, et cetera. So you might argue with me on this, and that's fine, but it's been more socially acceptable for men to get tattooed. But women are actually more tattooed. So if we look at the people who are tattooed, across the US right now, women are coming in at just a little bit higher than men. So women are something like 57% of the people that get tattooed, and men are a little bit less. Now, that's probably because you have a lot of women who will get like a little tattoo, like a little something in a hidden spot, like a dolphin on their hip, or a heart or something they can like, or some quote on their ribs, you know what I'm talking about. All those kinds of tattoos that are just like a wink at individualism that you can hide. And think about that, how like we somehow think that it's okay to get a tattoo as long as you can hide it. Think about what that says about our society, that as long you can mark up your skin however you would like, as long as you hide it away so that people don't know to judge you for it. You know what I mean? There's a lot going on there with our ideas about what is considered okay to let people know about you, that it's okay to have like a little individualist flair as long as you hide it, etc., etc. So I want you to think about why it might be considered, even though women are more tattooed today, why it might be considered more socially acceptable for men to be tattooed. And one big reason I think is because we have this idea that we have a lot of different ideas, but one idea is that look at the way that we date today, right? Like look at online dating, Tinder dating, Grindr dating, Bumble dating, app dating, all of that. We're creating these ideas of ourselves, these very simplistic two-dimensional characters of ourselves, and we're putting them online. If you want to be like surfer girl, if you want to be outdoorsy girl, you post a picture of yourself like in a Subaru on the mountains with a dog. You want to be nerdy girl, you just get some glasses and some books, and maybe you're like posting stuff with Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. I don't know what's considered nerdy today. But the point of that is that you can kind of like take off these different characters. And if you tattoo yourself, well, it's a sign of permanence. And how can we really know who we are if somebody's not telling us, like, so in so many ways, that so many reactions that because I'm very tattooed, so so many reactions that I've seen to different people who are tattooed and different people who have reacted to my tattoos is kind of the idea that like if you assert yourself so strongly, then other people won't be able to decide who you are. And do we really have the ability to decide who we are? Think about how I thought about this a lot because I'm a parent and I have a daughter. And I see the way that people kind of control their children, but especially control their young girls with how they can have their hair, what they can wear, like what outfits they're allowed to wear. It used to, like when my daughter was in preschool, a lot of parents would complain about like how their daughter wanted to wear cowboy boots and what were they going to do if she was going to wear cowboy boots. And all I could think is, can we really expect these young girls who we tell can't even decide how long their hair is going to be or what shoes they're going to wear? We're trying to tell them that they don't even have the right to choose that for themselves. And then we expect them to grow up and understand consent, right? So we have this society that essentially tells young people, and especially young girls from a young age, that their hair is not under their control, that their clothing is not under their control, that who they are needs to reflect my vision of them. And then we expect them to grow up and know what consent is. And then when they don't know what consent is, we're like, God, that's stupid, right? So I want us to think about tattoos and how the assertion of personality, especially big personality, especially if you have big tattoos, how that is judged. And that's not true just for women, of course. I'm talking about women because I'm a tattooed woman. So it's easier for me to talk from my perspective. But I know many of you have very large tattoos and you're not very necessarily female. And so I want you to think about the discomfort that that might give people based on the idea that you are very much asserting who you are, and you're asserting something that is nonconformist. It's not nearly as nonconformist as it used to be, but you're asserting something that is nonconformist, and how reactions might reflect on what your gender is and reflect on what society expects of you. Because if you're a man and you're heavily tattooed, one thing that you're going to hear a whole lot, and I've heard this from many men who are heavily tattooed, is how are you going to expect to get a good job? Because that's your job, right? Your job in society as a man is to provide. I'm not saying that's your job. I'm saying that's what society says. So if your job in society is to provide, well, how are you going to expect to provide very well if you've covered yourself in tattoos? And in the same vein, if you're a woman and you cover yourself in tattoos, how are you going to expect to be respected if you somehow mark yourself up? Or somehow this idea behind like respectable body image and not altering that body image. This is a hard topic to get into without actually having a conversation with you all. But tattoos, think about how tattoos reflect gender roles and how it's interesting that women are more tattooed than men today. Okay, there's our, that's, if you remember, it's called the burqa. There's Afghanistan. There's a man in Afghanistan, a young man in Afghanistan, just to show you that young people, sorry, just to show you that men are expected to be covered as well, not head-wise, not hand-wise or feet-wise, and neither are women. By the way, women can show their hands and their feet, but men are expected to be covered to their ankles and to their wrists. That's true in Afghanistan, that's true in Iran, that's true in Saudi Arabia. This is a couple of years ago. This is a woman who is in Saudi Arabia. Again, look at the landscape. And remember I said up until very recently, it was illegal for women to drive a car. And so this woman found a loophole. And her loophole was, it doesn't say we can't drive an ATV. So she got on and as a protest drove this ATV, and she would drive it to work. She would drive it, to school. She was a student. And she would drive it to different places because it wasn't illegal for her to drive an ATV. And what she was doing was obviously getting around, for one, but she was also bucking a social norm and breaking a law. That civil disobedience, So civil disobedience is a little bit different than breaking a law that would harm someone, right? Civil disobedience is breaking an unjust law that doesn't actually hurt anyone when you break it. And that is always a great test of civil liberties, whether they're civil liberties that have to do with ethnicity, whether it has to do with gender, whether it has to do with sexuality, whether it has to do with ageism, whatever. If you have a law that you can break that doesn't actually hurt anyone, you should question why we have it. So think about that. That's our new Bechdel test. If we have a law in society that doesn't actually hurt anyone, why do we have it? If I break that law and it doesn't hurt anybody, if I break it, why do we have it? Think about that. Think about laws that we might have that if you break them, don't actually hurt anyone to break them. And why would we have those laws? And so what this woman was doing with her civil disobedience was showing that this law is in place for no reason. Obviously, she can drive a vehicle. Obviously, she can get herself from point A to point B by moving this vehicle around. So why does this law exist? Now, here in the US, where women drive every day and drive all kinds of different cars, ATVs, et cetera, you might think that this isn't much of a social stand against civil disobedience, right? You might think that this isn't much of a protest, but protest lives within its society. And so depending on the society is going to depend a lot on what that protest looks like. Just think about us 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when we had people who would protest unjust laws about who could use a bathroom. And that's still actually an issue, which we'll talk about when we get to the queer community. Or we had people who sat at counters in Woolworths, and they weren't allowed to sit there because they were people of color, and so they broke that law and were punished very, very heavily for it. So protest to us might not look nearly as severe as it would look to this woman. So now let's talk about circumcision. We've talked about circumcision earlier in the class, and I know that people laughed about it and, oh, she just can't not talk about sex. Once again, you have to think, why would I be so uncomfortable if somebody isn't actually talking about sex, but is talking about something like male circumcision? Why would I even equate that to sex? Okay, so the idea of circumcision is removing some part of the genitals, for one. So that's the idea of circumcision, removing some part of the genitals. So we want to ask who is circumcised and where. Usually I would ask that in class, and people would say men, and a few people would say women. A few people would know about female circumcision. So let's first talk about male circumcision, and then we'll talk about female circumcision. And I know you probably know what male circumcision is because you live in society where male circumcision is somewhat common, and because we've talked about it in class, but it's the removal of that foreskin. So you have the penis, you have that extra little skin, and what that skin does is it protects the penis head, and the penis head is covered in nerve endings. And so you want to protect those nerve endings because they're nerve endings, right? So why do we circumcise? Well, male circumcision it actually begins in Egypt, but the person who gets credit for it in the world is Abraham. And Abraham is the founder of Judaism. Well, he's not the founder, but he's the person that Judaism, Islam, and Christianity is based on. And when we get to religion, we'll talk about those three religions and who Abraham is. But Abraham, as a sign of the covenant of God, he had to circumcise all the men in his household. And those were men who were related to him as well as servants. So that's interesting because, okay, so God told him, he was a prophet, so he spoke to God. God told him as a covenant of God, of his God, right? He had to circumcise all the men in his house. And they didn't just have to be his relatives, they had to be the servants, anybody who came into his house. So you have to think, why would God tell him to cut off part of everybody's penis as a mark of the covenant of Abraham and God? That we'll talk about later when we talk about religion. But a really key factor in there is that the person didn't just have to be related to him. It was everybody who worked in his house. Can you imagine if you were a servant in that household and your employer was like, okay, so now here's one more requirement on top of like cleaning the floor and feeding the animals and stuff like this. I'm going to have to cut off part of your penis. So the reason that they did it, like really, so there was their whole religious reason, which again, we'll talk about later when we talk about religion. But the reason that they did it is because they lived in an atmosphere, in a climate, I keep saying atmosphere, in a climate that led to a lot of male yeast infections. So that extra little piece of skin and the moisture in that piece of skin led to a lot of male yeast infections in that climate. And male yeast infections were a big deal. They could lead to infertility or possibly even death. So you didn't want that. So by cutting off that little piece of skin, what you were doing is you were saving people from possibly infertility and possibly even an infection that could kill them at that time. Now you can tell people that. You can be like, okay, if we just cut off this little piece of skin, it's going to save you a world of problem. I know it's going to hurt at first, but there's going to be like a world of just goodness that's going to come out of it. People are still going to be like, no, I don't know. I think I'm good with my skin. I trust my skin. It's not going to hurt me. It's not going to cause any kind of infections later. It's all good. I'll just clean it really well. I'm a clean person, right? So that's the thing about human psychology, is that we can have perfectly reasonable explanations for things, and people are still like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm good over here. Think about climate change, that we're still debating climate change. You can't debate a fact, for one. And two, it doesn't matter if we debate it. It's happening around us, whether we agree that it's happening or not. You know, it's like a relationship. It's like, if you've ever been in a relationship where somebody tries to break up with you and you're like, no, it's not happening. I just don't agree that it's happening. It's still going to happen, whether you agree with it or not. So when we look at male circumcision, what we're looking at is something that made a lot of sense to the physical geography, to your body's reactions to the physical geography, that people were not willing to go along with until religion came in, until they were like, well, God said. And it's like, okay, well, if God said, I guess we're going to have to do it. So you have the beginning of this tradition that then gets fed into these religions that come out of Abraham. So when we look at male circumcision, it's something that very much follows religion. Now you might think, oh, I'm circumcised and I'm not religious. Well, that's because If you live in a society that's dominated by that religion, it doesn't matter if you're religious or not, those dominant religions become the cultural norm. Now, that's a little bit different here in the US, but if we look at where people are circumcised, so let me go back to our world map. Not that many people, not that many men are actually circumcised in the world. Only 20%, only 20% of men in the world are circumcised. And those men tend to be right in here. So only 20% of the men in the world are circumcised, and 70% of those men are Islamic men. So only 20% of the world's population is circumcised, and 70% of that 20% is Islamic. So the majority of men in the world today who are circumcised because they're Islamic. And because Abraham, remember, was the patriarch to all three of those major religions: Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. So when you have a religion like Islam, which is 1.6 billion people, and it's a requirement of that religion to be circumcised, that's going to be the lion's share of people who are circumcised in the world. Jews are circumcised as well, but Jews are only 2% of the world's population, so it's not the lion's share of people who are circumcised. Now, Christianity comes out of Abraham as well, but when Christianity was adopted into Europe, Europeans didn't circumcise, so that was a part of the custom that stayed with Judaism, but didn't follow Christianity. So if we look at people who are, now remember, male circumcision comes from a practical place, the place of trying to avoid male yeast infections, gets incorporated into a religion, then becomes tradition that we now see that tradition or that custom spread with that religious dominance. Does that make sense? So you see how this is all part of the conversation about gender, that we're talking about gender, we're talking about how ideas about gender might affect you depending on where you are, and how those ideas about gender very much come from cultural custom, and cultural custom has all different ways of being created: physical geography, practical implications of like what keeps you healthy, what keeps you safe, and how those things might get absorbed into a religion, and then now they're part of that religion as part of that cultural custom instead of being part of this like medical need or something like that. Okay, following me? All right, so you might wonder why it is common in the US for people to circumcise. It's about 60% or 65% of men in the US today are circumcised. So not actually that many if you think about it, only about 65%. I mean, it's a lot, but it's not the majority. People tend to think that like all men in the US are circumcised. And there's a lot of different reasons that men might not be circumcised, and we're circumcising less and less. Ideas that it's mutilation, ideas that it's a cultural custom that doesn't really have a place in society anymore. And that also shows an influx of immigration, and that different parts of the world, like I said, don't have the cultural custom of circumcising. So when those people move into a place where you do circumcise and they don't start to circumcise, then you're going to see less people circumcised. That makes sense. So the US, it's common. Canada, it's common. Australia, it's common. New Zealand, it's common. And that's interesting because in the rest of the world, outside of North Africa, Southwest Asia, and these four pretty large countries, parts of Africa circumcise, but not that commonly. But the rest of the world doesn't really circumcise. So Latin American countries don't really circumcise. East Asian countries don't. South Asian countries don't. It's something that you see as a result of Abraham and the adoption of, or sorry, the religions that come from Abraham, and where those religions tend to dominate, and how those dominant cultural principles reflect things like who circumcises today. So in Latin America, you have Roman Catholicism as part of colonization, and Roman Catholics, like I said, when Christianity has spread into Europe, they leave that Jewish custom behind and they don't circumcise. And so Europeans today still don't circumcise, but who does circumcise are the British. So over here in, where's my arrow? Come on. Over here in Britain, you have circumcision, which is common. And that is why these countries, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, commonly circumcise, because they're all colonies, and I know that the US has a lot of different cultures in it, and Canada has that French part and stuff like that. But the dominant culture in those different countries comes from England. I know that there's many different cultures, but the dominant culture comes from Britain. And the reason that British people circumcised is because there was this person who linked masturbation and circumcision in Britain. So the idea was if you circumcise your boys, they'll masturbate less. And that is why we circumcise people overwhelmingly in Canada, the US, and Australia and New Zealand today, because some guy in England said that if you circumcise, people will masturbate less. Think about that. That is really the reason that we commonly circumcise today. I know that that's probably not the reason that your parents circumcised you if they circumcised you. I know that your mom probably wasn't like, well, there was that British researcher who a couple hundred years ago said that this is going to cut down on masturbation, so let's go that way. I know that that's probably not what your mom or your dad was thinking. They were probably thinking it's the cultural custom. In fact, my sister circumcised her son. I should stop saying that now as he becomes a young adult. When I was a baby, it was probably okay to talk about, but you'll be the last class. So she circumcised her son, and I remember asking her, why would you do that? Why? There's no right. And she said, well, because his dad is circumcised. His dad comes from Iran. Remember that this is the place that we're going to see commonly, like this is the most common place we're going to see circumcised people outside of these former English colonies. And so it was somehow his dad was circumcised, so he should be circumcised. Like everybody's penis has to match, like you're all sitting around your Passover Seder, or maybe your Passover Seder. You're all sitting around your Thanksgiving dinner, and like there's one point where everybody's just like, let's make sure everybody matches in here. So that, my sister's explanation, really speaks to cultural custom, really speaks to this idea that we do certain things in society because they've been done before, without questioning their origins, without questioning whether they're practical anymore. It's just, what is the norm? Is my child going to be looked at funny if they have something about them that's a little bit different? Whether it's circumcision, whether it's a haircut, whether it's the way that they're supposed to dress, all of those things. What is the cultural norm? And do you see the way that ideas about gender, ideas about what your body should look like, what you should dress like, later when we talk about race, ethnicity, the queer community, do you see how when we don't think about cultural customs and their origins, they just perpetuate different marginalizing parts of our society? So if we have parts of our society that marginalize us based on gender, based on race, based on sexuality, but we don't question how we're perpetuating those, how can we really expect them to stop, right? So we know about male circumcision. We know why. Now, is it cultural? Is it religious? Is it social? I would argue that it's all of those, right? That's what we were just saying. And where, like I said, North Africa, Southwest Asia, mostly, and then the colonies that would have been English colonies, and Britain. So it's believed to be hygienic still. We still have this idea that it's hygienic. It's a rite of passage in different cultures for both, well, for boys, but then girls. Now, let's talk about female circumcision. Called female circumcision, sometimes called female genital mutilation, sometimes called female genital cutting. And there is a TED Talk that I posted. I want you to watch that TED Talk now, if you want to pause right now and go watch it and come back. If you watched it, then you learned that that female circumcision is the removal of the clitoris. Okay, so there's so much going on in female sexual organs that I wish that we had talked about in class. I wish that we'd had the time to talk about it in class. But just think about how, remember last time we talked about language and how language tells us a lot about culture. Think about our language for female genitalia. We don't actually have a word that encompasses all of female genitalia, if you think about it. So you might be thinking, yes, we do, vagina, right? That's like the medical term. But vagina is just the canal. It's just the canal that the baby comes out of, right? That's not all of your genitalia if you're female. That's just one part. There's all these different parts, like the labia minora, the labia majora, the vulva, the clitoris, the best part, the urethra. All of those are different pieces of the genitalia. And the reason that I'm bringing this up, don't worry, there's a reason that I just named all those things. It's not just because I love to name female genitalia. But one thing is, it tells us a lot about our culture that we refer to female genitalia as the vagina, as just this one part that has everything to do with baby making and nothing to do with all the other stuff that comes out of female genitalia, right? So what does that say about our society, that we take female genitalia and we boil it down to just the part that has to do with the babies, right? We leave the clitoris out. The clitoris isn't in the vagina. It's not in the vagina. It's outside the vagina, right? So when we're talking about female genital mutilation, that's really what you want to call it. It's not vaginal mutilation, because you're not actually mutilating the vagina. You're mutilating the rest of female genitalia. And just to let you know where it happens mostly in here where the red is. I'm going to go over the different types, but you have about 128 million women in 28 countries around the world, but they're mostly right in here, right in that middle part of Africa. It happens in some isolated communities in South America and the Pacific and North America. That's usually because of immigrant communities that have come from this part of the world that then bring those cultural traditions with them. In fact, in the helpful videos, I'm going to put a TED Talk about a woman from, she's from Sierra Leone and she lives in Australia now, and she talks about female genital mutilation. So I'll put that in helpful videos. Watch that. She's funny. Watch it. All right. So what happens is you have the removal, first of all, of the clitoris. Now, if you don't know what the clitoris is, I said it was the best part. It's the best part because it's the only organ. It's the only organ that people have, and it's only female, only women have it. But it's the only organ that has one function, and that one function is pleasure. There's other organs that have one function. What I'm saying is it's the only organ that's only function is pleasure. It's all it's there for. And so removing it, what are you doing? Its only function is pleasure. So if you're removing it, what does that say? The fundamental, like bottom reason that you would remove it is to remove that sexual pleasure. Okay, so that clitorectomy, the removal of the clitoris, that's your basic female genital mutilation. The majority of these countries where you see female genital mutilation, and here, what you have is a more advanced mutilation. So excision, which is happening in this pink, that's the removal of the clitoris, the labia minora, and the labia majora sometimes. So remember, that's why it was important that I said all those different parts. So the removal of the clitoris, the minora, and the majora. And if you don't know what those are, you've got the vulva, that's the part that the hair grows out of, right? You've got the vaginal canal, you've got the clitoris, and then you have like what kind of look like lips. That's the minora and the majora. So removing that. Okay, and then infibulation, and that's what's happening in these red parts. In fact, if we were in Somalia, 90% of the women have gone through infibulation. 90% of the women in this country right here. Here, I'll just run away. 90% of those women have undergone what's called infibulation. So what that is the removal of the clitoris, the removal of the minora, the majora, and the taking the vulva and sewing it together. And it's sewed together until she gets married. And when she's married, what happens is that's when it's broken apart, right? So once again, this is something that people do because it's cultural. In fact, most commonly, if you ask someone why they were doing this, it's because it's tradition. Some people think that it's religious. It is absolutely not included in Islam. People think that it's an Islamic practice. It's not included in Islam. In fact, I had a student in class once who said, oh, but in the Quran, it says that you can't marry a woman who's not a virgin. It does not say that in the Quran. It doesn't say that. Otherwise, widows wouldn't be able to get married, right? So we have this idea that somehow female genital mutilation is required by religion. It is not. It is something that would have existed in societies before Islam came along and then gets kind of absorbed conveniently. We'll see this with Christianity, we'll see this with a lot of different religions, but it's something that then gets like, a lot of times there's a pre-existing cultural idea that when you have a universalizing monotheist religion that comes into your culture, these little parts of culture kind of seep through, and now they show up, and now it's like, oh, we do it because it's religious. No, wait, you don't, though, because it's not actually included in the religion. Oh, but we do because it's just normal cultural tradition. So when we look at female circumcision or female genital mutilation, it is completely cultural. Some people would say it's religious. It's not part of a religion. Whereas male circumcision is. Male circumcision is part of the covenant of Judaism. It's required in Islam, but nowhere does it say anything about cutting off women's genitals in any holy book. It's something that's done because it's considered a good tradition. And if you think about who is perpetuating it, well, it's perpetuated by society as a whole, but often it's the mothers who are pushing their daughters. So it happens when a girl is about 9 years old. From about 9 to 12 years old is when it's going to happen. And think about that. That's right when she's coming into sexual maturity. It could be carried out at a very young age, but it's generally done when she goes into puberty. It's usually performed without anesthesia. You have a traditional circumciser who comes into a village. She's going to bring in all the girls who need to be circumcised, are ready to be circumcised. And there's this whole ceremony. You have like a big old party. The girls get a whole bunch of presents and stuff like that. And then their genitalia gets cut off. Now, it's practiced in 28 countries, like I said. The World Health Organization talks about how 100 to 140, it's probably 140 million women worldwide who have been mutilated, genitally mutilated, and the majority of those women are in Africa. Like I said, right through that middle part of Africa, not all over Africa, right through that middle part of Africa. So often this is something that's perpetuated by mothers, where mothers are like, no, my daughter has to get circumcised. It's time for her to get circumcised. And a lot of people, students I've had in the past, are very surprised by that. They think it's going to be perpetuated by fathers. And there are plenty of fathers who are perpetuated as well, but it's most commonly that women want, like, that you have, it's considered this female tradition, right? The person who circumcises is a woman. It's this kind of like women's tradition. And that might surprise you because their mothers would have gone through this whole thing as well when they were 9 or 10 or 11 years old. And you would think they wouldn't want to do that to their daughters. But remember that this is so ingrained in a culture. Remember that these are cultures where a woman's livelihood is based on her marriage. And if you aren't circumcised, your chances of getting married are very, very low. So inside, let's say we're in a village in Kenya. Let's go back. So let's say we're in a village in Kenya, and inside that village, a girl's livelihood, her security in life is based on getting married. And she's not going to get married unless she goes through this mutilation. So if you think about the mothers who are perpetuating it, we might think like, what is the matter with those people? But remember that they live inside a society that is teaching them that their daughter's success is dependent on following these cultural rules. And when I put it that way, think about all of the things that our parents might have done to us that weren't actually for our benefit, but were done to keep us inside a culture to follow cultural rules. If anybody has an eating disorder, think about who might have perpetuated your eating disorder, right? If we have different ideas about beauty or different ideas about how much we should talk or what we should talk about or conversation or et cetera, think about who tends to perpetuate those gender roles. While gender roles might be part of a larger society, they're often perpetuated by people inside that society who, you know, in some sense might be thinking that they're doing what's best for you because they want you to fit into a society, even though in the long run it's really not good for you whether we're looking at general cutting, whether we're looking at the size of your body, whether we're looking at the length of your hair, whatever it is, people who might be telling you like your hair needs to look like that, your body should look like this, you shouldn't be tattooing yourself. They might be doing it because they think that it's going to be what's best for you, even though it's ignoring what you want. Well, think about that in different societies. And I know this is a very extreme, in no way am I saying that body image and anorexia is the same thing as cutting off genitals. I'm just saying that within cultures, we have different norms that might be pretty harmful to us, and then we perpetuate them because they're norms. So, so yeah. So you have a lot of campaigns to stop female circumcision, like here in Uganda, for example. But remember that when something is part of a culture, it can take a while for it to be kind of fed out, especially if the economy depends on, or if the economy is kind of centered around those gender roles. So think about it that way. That and remember when we talked about population, I talked about how for thousands of years China had a son preference. They had a preference to have a boy because a boy was your retirement plan, right? A boy, your oldest son is supposed to take care of you when you go into old age. So if I can only have one child, well, I want to have a boy because that's who's going to take care of me when I'm old. But what happens in a couple of decades, you now have way more boys and very few girls. So if you want your boy to be married, what do you have to do? He has to meet a girl, right? And he has to buy her a ring, a car, and a house. Remember, that's norm today in China. Who is paying for that? His parents. His parents are buying the house and they're buying the car and putting money on all of that stuff. And so today, if you remember, the norm in China is to, or not the norm in China, that Chinese couples want to have a girl. If you can only have one child, then you want to have a girl because she's going to be a lot less expensive in the long run. Like, yeah, she's not going to take care of you maybe when you're old. She probably will, but as far as custom goes, the daughter's not the one who takes care of you when you're old, but you're going to have to get that son married before he can take care of you when you're old, and that's going to cost you a lot of money. So thousands of years of son preference switched to a daughter preference in a couple of decades because it made more economic sense. So as long as you have an economy that is somewhat based around gender roles, and those gender roles in this part of the world, for example, in Uganda, have to do with marriage, have to do with female genital mutilation as a passage into marriage, well, it's going to be hard for that to be weeded out of society. Does that make sense? Okay. And as a result of those gender roles and lack of access to birth control and stuff like that, you also are going to inherently have an imbalanced society. As long as women don't have access to birth control, they're going to get pregnant younger. They're not going to be able to go to school for as long as they want to, and they're not necessarily going to be the same participant in an economy. Keeping an economy that has this dependent structure of men and women, where men are the economic earners and women are dependent on them. So I have this, why does this happen with marriage? When I was talking about, the perpetuation of gender roles on and like general cutting and stuff like that, and how that's perpetuated like within society. Sometimes I'll bring up like a picture of people getting married and how it's thought of as this total cultural norm, and it's this thing that we're all just supposed to do. Like we kind of grow up with the idea that like, yeah, I'm going to do this and this, and of course I'm going to get married, that's what I'm going to do, without thinking about why and what it might mean and whether we actually want it and what it means to find someone that you're going to now compromise your life for the rest of your life because it's part of a culture, and that we tend to perpetuate those ideas onto our children over and over again. So I want to go back. Oh, there's a bridal procession in India. India is the most stratified economy in the world. So You have a stratified economy in the world where you have a lot of very poor people and some very rich people and not a whole lot of people in between. And they have these mass bridal processions as a way to save money. And a lot of people, when I show this picture in class, I'll have students who are like, oh, so you just have a bunch of women and a bunch of men and they just grab each other and now they're married. Oh, they know who they're marrying. This is just a way to save money. You have these like mass bridal processions. So before we end today, I want to go back to the Comstock laws for a minute and talk about something else that comes out of the repealing of these laws. So birth control becomes legal, and then in 1972, Roe versus Wade, that's the Supreme Court decision that made abortion legal. It's decided on, and so in 1973, abortion becomes legal in the US. And pretty much, I meant to say legal. I don't know if I said legal. Becomes legal in the US. And pretty much since then, there's been laws that have been created to chip away at access to abortion. For example, in the beginning, abortion was covered by Medicare. And that was one of the first things that was overturned, where, okay, you couldn't have federal funding go towards abortion. And since then, you've had a whole lot of different states implement different hurdles to having an abortion, things like waiting periods. Alabama, for example, has a 48-hour waiting period from when you tell a physician you intend to have an abortion to when you're going to have an abortion. Different states have laws about, they have to tell you if you're going to have an abortion, what stage your fetus is, like if they have fingernails or something like that. There's different requirements of like what you have to tell the person. In different states, they require people to listen to a fetal heartbeat before you get an abortion, stuff like that. And then there's other things. So I posted a video on abortion laws, and I did that specifically to look at how different states have created obstacles around getting an abortion. And I don't want to talk about abortion a whole lot, but I want us to think about why we're still talking about abortion. And I know that that's kind of an obtuse question where you might be like, we're still talking about it because it still exists or blah, blah, blah. But why we're still talking about abortion, because we're constantly talking about abortion and how to keep abortion legal or not keep it illegal, depending on who's talking to who, where, instead of talking about the real issue. And the real issue is birth control. We can agree that nobody really wants an abortion, right? That nobody is like, I need, what I would like to do tomorrow is get a haircut and get my nails done and get an abortion. Like, that's not really the the way that people go about having an abortion. So we can agree that it's something we want to reduce in society. But the number one way to reduce it, statistically proven, is access to birth control. So why aren't we talking about that? When we talk about abortion and limiting abortion, why are we talking about literally limiting a woman who's already pregnant to abortion instead of increasing access to birth control that would then lead to fewer abortions? So statistically, it's proven that access to birth control means fewer abortions, right? If you have access to birth control, you don't get pregnant. The question of abortion doesn't become a question. But why aren't we ever discussing that? Why aren't lawmakers talking about, you know what, we don't want people to have abortions, so we're going to make sure that everybody has access to birth control everywhere. We're going to stock condoms. We're going to stock why can't I think of any other form of birth control right now? We're going to stock all kinds of different types of birth control so that everybody has access to birth control, and that way we reduce the number of abortions, right? That's not the conversation that we're having, which is why I want you to question what that conversation is really about. Because if we do want to reduce the number of abortions, why aren't we talking about birth control? That's what we should be talking about. If we're truly concerned with abortions, we should be talking about birth control. So if we're not talking about birth control, I want you to think about why people might be talking about abortion at all, why they might be what is the objective in trying to restrict people from getting an abortion when the way to restrict abortions is to give access to birth control. Think about why that might be, for one. And think about the misinformation when I talked about the Comstock laws, how we still have a whole lot of misinformation. People hear all kinds of stuff about abortion. But 92% of abortions happen in the first 12 weeks. So 92% of abortions are abortions that are done where you take a pill, you induce a miscarriage. It isn't necessarily just a pill, but basically what you're doing is you're inducing a miscarriage. You're doing it at a very, very early state in the pregnancy. 92% of abortions are done that. It is very hard to get an abortion after that 12-week. Even here in California, which is a pretty liberal place when it comes to abortions, it is pretty hard to find a doctor who will perform an abortion after 12 weeks unless there's some sort of medical need for it. So think about that misinformation that we learn that, people are having abortions like at any stage. They're like 7 months pregnant. They're like, and I'm rethinking this whole baby thing. That doesn't happen. It happens all pre 12 weeks. And think about why, when talking about abortion, we're not automatically talking about increased access to birth control. Okay. And watch the video that I posted on abortion laws. Watch Kekenya Ntaya talk about female genital mutilation. And then I posted another like 5-minute video on the gender wage gap. And what else did I post for this? I know I posted another video about education and women's access to education, and how that leads to a stronger economy, and et cetera, et cetera. And then I posted another TED Talk on masculinity, where a man talks about how societal ideas about masculinity have shaped his life. So watch all of those. Have a good week. I'm going to post another lecture in a couple of days on race and racism. And then we have ethnicity, then we have gender. No, we already talked about gender. Then we have sexuality. Then some kind of cultural hodgepodge of like funeral processions and stuff like that. And then we're going to talk about religion, and then we're done. What I'm getting from all of you overwhelmingly is you want to have a multiple choice final. So I've asked people to let me know what kind of a final they would prefer, short answer, multiple choice, and all I've heard is multiple choice. So if you feel differently, let me know. But otherwise, we're going to do a final multiple choice, and I will send out an email about that very soon. All right, bye. Miss seeing you all in class for sure. I just turned myself off. I think I'd figure out how to do this by now.